I am a finito. We weave death and watch over the dead.
This task was granted to me by the one who gave us the first death.
How long have Pontiff Sulyvahn and Aldrich, the Saint of the Deep, been up to their scheming and conquest? It's hard to say for sure, but quite a while is probably a safe bet. But these two are certainly a match made in bad guy heaven. We know what they're doing now, occupying Anor Londo and devouring the god of the Dark Moon. But where were they before? How did they meet? And how did they rise to the positions they find themselves in now? I think I have an idea, or a wild speculation, which I suppose are one and the same in Dark Souls. Gravelord Nito once led a covenant of disaster, the Gravelords. Using the Eyes of Death, the Gravelords would lure their phantoms into neighboring worlds in order to spread disaster and destruction across those worlds. But the phantoms lured could end in defeat, allowing the Eyes of Death to multiply and leading to further proliferation of Bane. In Dark Souls 2, we learn of the Grave Wardens. While not exactly the same as the Gravelords, they do have their similarities. The Grave Wardens weaved death and watched over the dead, a task that was granted to them by the one who gave the first death. Which is certainly an interesting phrasing. We know that Nito was the first of the dead, but there has been a long debate about whether or not that's a translation error, and it's meant to describe Nito as the one who gave the first death. Or maybe it's not, and he is the first of the dead, given to death by the one who appointed the Grave Wardens. The point being that whether it's two separate individuals or not, their relation to death and crypts and skeletons and whatever are basically the same. They preside over death and the dead. Now, there was a group who plotted against the gods, and at one point attempted to steal the power of Gravelord Nito as referenced in Dark Souls 1. And in Dark Souls 2, there is a reference to a group who attempted to conquer the undead crypt. Now, whether those are two separate groups, two separate incidents, or perhaps one inspired by the other is hard to say. But I do think that Aldrich was a part of one of these groups, and Sulyvahn was on the opposing side. We of course know that Sulyvahn was born in the Painted World long ago, but eventually left because he hadn't experienced loss, and had ambitions in the outside world. He sought a purpose that was bigger than himself, and I believe he found himself within the ranks of the Grave Wardens, defending the dead and learning everything about death itself. Hell, the Pontiff's armor isn't even completely dissimilar to the Grave Warden's set, it's just more flashy. And we know Aldrich was once a regular old cleric, until he began devouring human flesh and grew too ambitious. And perhaps in doing so, he found himself storming tombs and trying to overthrow the gods. Because let's not forget that when consuming men was not enough for him, he began to devour the gods instead. And maybe in the tombs he did find the power of the Gravelord that he sought, or more likely Sulyvahn taught him. In many ways, Sulyvahn and Aldrich were just as ambitious as the other. Sulyvahn wouldn't settle for forever remaining on watch over a crypt, but because Grave Wardens and Gravelord principles and leaders aren't all that off from one another, Sulyvahn learned the way of both. But most importantly, the importance of the Eyes of Death. Consider again what it is these eyes do. They lure phantoms into neighboring worlds to spread disaster. And then consider Sulyvahn's army of Outrider Knights, who were said to be given the eyes of the Pontiff, and these knights peered into the black orbs, and they were lured into battles of death, and then transformed into frenzied beasts. Those two things sound identical, aside from the added benefit of Pontiff's eyes transforming the knights into mindless beasts, which is probably just the Sulyvahn special. The Pontiff studied the Eyes of Death and applied them to grow his own army. And perhaps that isn't all the secrets he learned from the Gravelord, as we can clearly see Aldrich using the Gravelord's sword dance miracle in our fight with him. More than likely a gift from Sulyvahn, just as the god of the Dark Moon was. Pontiff Sulyvahn used the eyes to spread disaster in as many places as he could, until nothing stood in he and Aldrich's way. Consider as well the Ring of the Evil Eye, which speaks of the spirit of a beast that ravaged and nearly destroyed Astora. I believe this to be some of Sulyvahn's early work with Aldrich, and Aldrich to be the beast. A spirit or phantom of a beast was dispatched to Astora, as described by the ring that references eyes. Eyes of which we know the Pontiff learned to manipulate and make his own. The eyes luring spirits to worlds, and his new eyes that turned them into beasts. So, Aldrich peered into the Pontiff's eyes, and that's not as romantic as it sounds. He transformed into a beast, and his spirit nearly destroyed all of Astora. And perhaps this is the change in Aldrich that made him begin to consume human flesh. So much of it that he would eventually bloat into sludge. Or it's the reason he became disillusioned with his ambitions in the first place, and decided that man was not enough to devour, and that he would need to devour the gods instead. And maybe Aldrich's destruction of Astora is the very same reason that Henri of Astora is hunting him down with such ferocity. Henri is even the one who gives you the ring, which seems pretty symbolic to why they hunt who they hunt. The Ring of the Evil Eye even grants you health upon killing an enemy, not unlike Aldrich devouring his fallen foes, as you're essentially consuming their essence for your own personal growth or needs. You just don't turn into sludge. Then, of course, we know most of Pontiff Sulyvahn and Aldrich's story from there on. The giant slug man being sacrificed to the first flame, but then coming back, only to abandon his post and get back to doing scheming things with his buddy the Pontiff. And Sulyvahn continuing his journey of power and conquests, discovering the profaned flame and taking over Anne Orlando and imprisoning Gwendolyn for Aldrich to soon eat. But it is interesting to consider the ideas of where all these Dark Souls characters were before we see where they're finally at. That is, of course, what all the lore is there to explore for.